Okay, so this is going to be the third module in my section of the class, and we're going to talk today about population ecology. Um, Again, there isn't that much reading related to population ecology in the textbook, so you really only have about 6 pages that are relevant for today. And I should also say that this week's lab is going to be about population ecology, so there's going to be quite a bit of overlap with the content today and the content in this week's lab. Okay, so just a bit of review. Remember we talked about the definition of populations. They're all the individual organisms of a single species in a defined area. We talked about how there are sort of a hierarchy of different levels of ecology, and so we're sort of skipping over the organisms for the time being, and we're going to think a little bit about populations. And remember, I used the example of jack pine for no other reason than I think it's a pretty tree, and we can see that this is the distribution of the population of jack pine throughout North America, and that includes their southernmost distribution in the north of Indiana at the sand dunes. And so what I want to get across to you today is that populations vary in time through a number of different population processes. And there's really only 3 or possibly 4, depending on how you want to think of it, right? So it's births and deaths, obviously control the dynamics of a population, and then and dispersal. And depending on how you want to think about dispersal, we can break that into immigration, individuals coming, and emigration, individuals leaving. But basically, it's births, deaths, and dispersal. And this basically summarizes all the interactions among individuals and the environment, right? You can imagine that birth rates of wild species are going to depend on resource availability. It might also depend on how harsh the winter was. Death rates are potentially going to depend on resource availability. Individuals might starve, or they might wilt if it gets too dry, or herbivores might actually kill trees. And then obviously, if individuals are coming and going, that's going to change the dynamics of populations as well. So that's what I want to get across to you today. And there's a couple ways to think about this, right? Populations have temporal continuity because of births and death rates, right? So, all of us are here today because our parents were here in the past and their parents before them in the past, right? So there's that temporal continuity of genes getting passed forward through time. But populations also have spatial continuity because of immigration and emigration, right? The reason why many of you are in Indiana probably is because your ancestors were in Indiana, right? And obviously that can be broken, right? Almost all of us, unless we're indigenous, came from somewhere other than Indiana. But again, that was due to immigration and emigration. You left whatever your ancestors' homeland was to immigrate into Indiana. And population ecology is important for the study of ecology, which is mainly what we're going to talk about today, but it's also really important for the study of evolution. Right? Because remember, evolution by natural selection is a population level process. And the reason that's true is because the DNA of individuals doesn't actually change that much from year to year, but the frequency of alleles in a population can change very rapidly. And that's essentially what evolution is, just a change in allele frequency, right? And the way we can connect ecology and evolution, we talked about this already, is through the concept of biological fitness, which we define as survival and reproduction, right? Births and deaths. So it's clearly a population level process. And if we have the sort of sum total of survival and reproduction, we can actually get a per capita birth and death rate at the population level process. So you can sort of see, if you've taken Botany 120 with Scott McAdam, you would have learned a lot about the different groups of plants, of photosynthetic organisms. It's not that important for this class, but we can track algae back through time because of that temporal continuity in population level processes, right? And similarly, the branching of mosses and ferns and gymnosperms off of algae, again, has that temporal continuity of genes being passed forward through time. Okay, so that's the relevance to evolution, but remember the central question in ecology is what controls the distribution and abundance of individuals? And this is almost always necessarily a population level question, right? And so many ecologists end up focusing on population ecology, and that's just because, usually we can't understand why any one individual happens to be where it is, right? Instead, what we do is we take samples at the population level, and we can, on average, figure out that certain individuals, prefer moist soil or dry soil, or they prefer high nutrient soil or low nutrient soil, right? On average at the population level. Okay, so if we ask that question, what controls the distribution and abundance of individuals? Part of it is that we have to think about how individuals vary in space and time. And there's three main properties. You can think of these as the 3Ds. And we're going to talk about these in sequence now. You can think about the distribution, the dispersion, or the density of individuals. Okay, so let's start with distribution, the first D. The distribution of a population is simply its geographical and ecological range. And obviously this is limited by the environment, and it's limited by interactions. And we saw this with jack pine. Remember, we sort of hypothesized what might be limiting the range of jack pine, and we used some maps to sort of rule out certain hypotheses, right? And so what we think is that it is limited by temperature, and it's limited by interactions on the sort of east and west, right? And so that's what limits the distribution of its ecological range. So now that we're thinking about population level processes, you can ask yourself, well, what do we know about the birth and death rate relative to each other, right? So inside the range of jack pine. And again, I really want you to try to participate with this type of discussion. So think about it for a second. What's the relative birth to death rate inside the range? Well, that's easy. We know that the births are either greater than or equal to the deaths. Otherwise, the population would disappear, right? There have to be more individuals being created, or at least the same number of individuals being created as are dying. Otherwise, the population would just vanish. Hopefully that's intuitive. You could ask the same question, what do we know about the distribution of jack pine outside the distribution? It's the opposite, right? Deaths now have to be greater than births, otherwise the population would begin to spread north and south, right? And so these are the things that control the distribution of a population. It's births and deaths. But remember, there's a third population level process, and that's dispersal, right? So here is the distribution of jack pine in North America. Why isn't jack pine in Russia, right? So we've come up with hypotheses that it's too cold, too hot, and that we have beetles on the east and the west, but there's perfectly suitable environmental conditions in Russia for jack pine, right? Hopefully it should be clear that it's dispersal that's limiting its distribution in Russia, right? We've got a pretty significant dispersal barrier here, and that's the Atlantic Ocean, right? And so this is a bit of an aside, but if you've heard of invasive species, humans create invasive species by breaking down dispersal barriers. So that's distribution. And don't get confused, dispersal is not one of the 3Ds. It's a population level process that leads to the sort of spatial and temporal patterns of populations. So the second D then is dispersion. This is probably a word you haven't heard before, but I'm going to define it for you. It describes the spacing of individuals. And really, there's probably a lot of different patterns, but I'm just going to give you two different patterns for the dispersion of individuals. And remember, all of these things are driven by births, deaths, and dispersal. So dispersion is just the spacing, right? So you could imagine we might have an even spacing of individuals across the landscape or possibly through time, right? And so you could imagine that maybe this is driven by things like competition for light. If all of these trees are shading an equal area around them, there's only an even spacing of individuals that could exist. And you can have clumped spacing, and this can be caused by maybe a clumped distribution of resources, or the fact that seeds are simply just falling down at the feet of their parents, right? So you could imagine if this species prefers moist soil, and this is just where the moist soil is, that's where you're going to find these species. And so these are the kinds of things that can control the dispersion of a population. Okay, and the third D is density. Density is just the number of individuals per unit area, right? And so, for example, I've told you that this is the sort of distribution of jack pine, but the density isn't equal in all places. If we zoom in on Ontario, you can see that we have a low abundance of jack pine here near James Bay and in southern Ontario around the bottom of Lake Huron. And you can see that we have really high density in a bunch of other places, north of Lake Huron, near the Upper Peninsula in Michigan, near the Manitoba border, right? So we see that the density is not constant across the range of jack pine. But this density can also vary in time as well as in space at the same time. Remember, we have spatial and temporal continuity of populations, right? So here's some example. It was just the best sort of data I could find. So there's a pest of cereal crops called the chinch bug. People have really good data on this because people care about the stuff that kills crops. So we've actually got year by year starting in the 1840s up to the 1930s. So each one of these squares is a year, and then you can see that it's in the state of Illinois. So you can see that the darkness here is telling you how much chinch bugs there are and what the density is, right? So we can see that in the 1840s, there wasn't very many, but there was an outbreak sort of in the Northwest. We can see that in the 1850s, there weren't very many, but they were primarily in the North and in the West. You can see that something wildly changed in the 1870s. They all of a sudden went from nothing to spreading through the entire state, and so on down the line. So you can see that it's varying in space, that it's sometimes in the South, like in the 1910s, that it's sometimes in the North, like in the 1860s, and that there are some decades, like the 1900s, where there are almost none. And so a really interesting question for an ecologist might be to try to think about why this would be the case. So that's the 3 Ds for population. So populations also have age or stage structure, depending on the individuals, right? So you can imagine that the population level processes are going to vary depending on either the age or the stage of the individual. And it usually sort of depends whether we're thinking about plants or animals when we mean age or stage, right? So for animals, age is probably also the stage, right? A teenager is basically defined by its age, and puppy is defined by its age, and all that kind of stuff. But in plants, age isn't usually that meaningful, right? You can have a seedling like this guy that hangs out on the forest floor for decades, and really it's the stage of the plant that matters. That's really the difference here, right? So the reason is that seeds and seedlings and adult trees just simply might not have the same chance of death, and they also don't have the same chance of giving birth, right? Seeds don't have any reproduction. Seedlings probably also don't have any reproduction. So we can refine our population understanding by creating these age or stage-based models, right? So populations vary in time according to births, deaths, as they struggle to survive, and also as they disperse. And so one of the ways we can describe this, and you'll see that this in the lab this week, is that populations have something called an intrinsic rate of growth. The idea is that this parameter summarizes the interactions among individuals with each other in the environment, and it's limited also by the biology of the species. So for example, our old friend Arabidopsis thaliana that you've seen in a few labs probably makes fewer seeds than a mature jack pine tree, simply because a mature jack pine tree is orders of magnitude bigger than an adult Arabidopsis plant. And so I want to think a little bit about how we can project population growth, right? So you've got births and immigration, which is a form of dispersal, that add individuals to the population, right? So if we were going to project it with some kind of mathematical model, we probably need to use a plus sign to think about these. We've also got deaths and emigration, which is another form of dispersal that simply subtract individuals from the population, right? So just the language we've used about this tells us a little bit about the type of mathematics we need to account for births, deaths, immigration, and emigration. Right? So let's say we want to know what's the population size in the next generation. So in 2021, right? We want to predict that. So we put an equal sign. And let's say we know the population size now, right? So we actually know exactly how many individuals of whatever population we're interested in. We know it now. Well, this is easy now, right? If we know the change in population size, then we can simply predict what the population is going to be in the next generation, right? So the way we write this, and you'll see this in lab, is that we often write this in the form of what are called difference equations. So we do n t plus 1, that's the population, the current time, cast forward 1 generation, right? So n t plus 1 is going to depend on how many individuals are there now. We add the births, subtract the deaths, add the immigrants, subtract the immigrants, and you're done. So you should be able to notice that we can actually do a little bit of cleaning up here. We can factor out the nt from all of these, and then we get this little term here that's b minus d plus I minus e, which we defined up here. And so what ecologists often do is they say, well, we don't usually know each of these individually, but we might be able to define a term R, which is the net effect of all of them, right? So we know that the population has changed, but we don't always know if it was due to births, due to deaths, because we simply can't watch every single individual in the population. So we define this R term as simply the sum of these things. And now we can simply write this as a really simple exponential equation. And ecologists call R the intrinsic rate of increase. And what we're going to do in lab this week is you're going to try to estimate R for one of the smallest angiosperms in the world, which is Lemna minor or duckweed. So that's how you project population growth. But remember, we're talking about how populations also have age or stage structure, right? Well, this is also really easy. We could have, let's say there are these many stages of jack pine: seed, seedling, sapling, and canopy tree. And we've determined that each of these have slightly different birth rates, slightly different death rates, etc. Right? So to calculate the total population, we just need 4 equations of the one I just showed you, right? So seeds are born at a certain rate, they die at a certain rate, they can blow in on the wind or be carried in by birds and other things like that at a certain rate, right? The same for seedlings, but here's the key now: seedlings don't actually move, so we know that these are 0, and etc. for the saplings and the canopy trees, right? Once a seed is germinated, it can't move anymore, but births and deaths can happen. And the way to think of these births is sort of like, as a seed graduates to a seedling, we imagine that seedling is being born from a seed, a sapling is born from a seedling, and so on. And in the next video, we're going to take a look at the consequences of this intrinsic rate of increase.